Hey, good. I'm an ethnographer, so I spend time looking at how people use technology in their daily life. And in the last 15 years, I've particularly concentrated on communication channels. And I've been quite lucky because every 2 years there's a new channel emerging. And so I'm constantly, in a certain sense, updating my understanding of what people do with all the channels they have at their disposal. Oh, this is ugly. Here we go. So one of the things I do is I ask people to keep diaries for a few days of all the exchanges they have privately, private exchanges. And so they will write down, which channel they're used, with whom they've been speaking, or communicating on what content. And apart from the interest of the diary itself, what is interesting, in fact, is to discuss afterwards why they choose to send an email rather than an SMS, why they choose to send an SMS rather than make a call. And what we realize is that the reasoning behind each of these choices is extremely sophisticated. And it's really not just to do about financial constraints, it's not about the pricing of each channel, it doesn't even have to do with the availability of the channels, because at least in developed countries, most people have at their disposal, and they're usually sitting with a mobile next to them, a computer not far, maybe a landline. And so how they choose and which channel they choose for a specific interaction is, I say, highly sophisticated. And I'll show you in which respect. Now, one of them, I apologize, I realized people in the back, I didn't realize these slides would be quite as small. But one of the most stable findings that we all, as social scientists, are finding at the moment when we study communication is that the number of regular contacts people use with different channels is actually quite small. I'll go through them in turn. On the mobile phone, mobile calls, most people make 80% of their calls to 4 people. If I ask you to look in your history list in your mobile phone, I can assure you that if you go through it, probably 80% of your calls, of your private calls, I'm not talking of the professional environment, will be done to 4 people. Talking about Skype, Skype researchers themselves tell me that essentially Skype is used with 1 or 2 distant relatives. So the buddy list in Skype is of about 2 to 3 people. The landline, talk with any telecom, they will tell you the majority of calls are done, again, to fewer than 5 people. As we move up on text-based channels, SMS, around 10. 10 is a number of regular people you interact with. Instant messaging, we're even closer to 5 than to 10. One can have, and young people have very large buddy lists, but the actual frequent interactions are with very few. Email, again, for personal reasons, down to 10. The only exception are social networking sites. And there is only because people have 100 and more contacts. And here, however, if the number goes up to over 100, it's because of the postings. But again, Facebook researchers tell us that if we look at the email function or the instant messaging function in Facebook, the numbers are down to 4 or 5. Two-way communication in Facebook is dedicated, again, to 4 or 5 people. Now, and this is a very stable phenomena. We've seen this through time. It doesn't seem to be varying. These numbers don't seem to be varying much across time. If anything, they tend to decline. As a new channel emerges, then it goes down. Now, let me try to explain this phenomenon. Well, if you ask people to describe, to write down their social environment, who are the people they care for, who composes their social network, we get little pictures like this. And interestingly, they're quite small. There's a couple of the parents, a few friends, a few siblings. So if I describe social networks in terms of concentric circles, with the intimate circle, the people you really care for, in the center, and then the close people which one feels close to, and then the weak ties, the typical numbers we find is about 5 people in the intimate, about 15 in the close circle, and then a big variability in the weak ties. Some people will have 10, some people will have 500. But what is interesting is that this sort of data is also relatively cross-cultural, so that we go across countries and across cultures, and we tend to find these sort of 20 close close contacts. And interestingly, what changes is the composition. So in some cultures, it will be more part of the family and relatives. In other cultures that are more oriented toward friendship, maybe it will be friends. Now let's go back to the communication issue. Again, if we ask people not only to write down who their contacts are, who is close to them, but to write down what channels they're using with these contacts, we start to find interesting patterns. So one of the things that we find, first of all, is that the closer groups has a lot of redundancy. So people tend to use a lot of channels with people that are close. They send them SMSs and they call them up and email. The further away you get, the more mono-channel you get. So basically, your old friend from school maybe will only be on Facebook, maybe you'll send him a Christmas card, but it will be just one channel. And there's a lot of redundancy the closer you get. But there's another interesting phenomena which will link up with those graphs I show you. There seems to be some channels that seem to be dedicated more to some category of contacts. So typically voice, if we look at the voice channels seem to be dedicated to the really close relation. Text to the closer sort of friends and relatives, and broadcasted channels like Twitter or Facebook tend to be dedicated to the further away contacts. So let's go back to and try to cluster those channels as I was doing before. So the first obvious thing about what do these channels that have such low, below five contacts have in common? They're synchronous. And what do the other channels, the textual channels, have in common? One that reach to the close links have in common, they're asynchronous. And the third type of channels are broadcast. But this doesn't tell us much. What does it mean from a social relation point of view? What does it mean to be synchronous or asynchronous? Now, I would argue that what it really means, it has to do about giving attention to each other. So what does synchronous mean? Synchronous means that if I receive a phone call just now, I would drop what I'm doing, stop talking to you, stop focusing on that, pick up the phone and focus on my conversation. I would have to give my immediate full attention to the conversation. If I receive an email just now, maybe I'm receiving some emails. Later today I will check my email, and the person who has sent me my emails know that I will defer my attention. It's still a personal message, it's still directed to me, I will still feel a sense of obligation to reply in most cases, but it is up to me to choose the moment in which I focus attention on that person and that communication. Social networking, paradoxically, it is in the media, we always talk about Facebook and social networks as the channels in which people are most invasive, intrusive, and flaunting themselves. On the contrary, if we think in terms of attention, it is the least attention-demanding channel, because from the moment I'm posting to 150 people, I'm not obliging anybody, I'm not talking to anybody in particular, and therefore no one of those 150 actually has a sense of obligation to reply to me, which is exactly what makes, in a certain sense, Facebook so addictive, because there's no obligation to reply. When somebody does reply, when somebody does comment on what I've written, it's an incredible gift, because I know that that person didn't feel any social obligation to answer, which actually makes people quite satisfied of that type of interaction. So what I'm actually seeing is that I'm seeing a completely inverse relationship between the level of attention required by a channel and the number of contacts. So, as I said, Skype with video, where we also have to look at each other, and I have to really, I can't even walk around and pretend I'm doing something, and pretend I'm just concentrating like in a call, is clearly the highest attention-demanding channel, and it has the lowest number of interlocutors. And as I go down in the attention level, I see that the number of communication partners increase. Now you can see that there is no real relationship between the cost of the communication and the number of contacts. So Skype, which is free, and may I say that I do a lot of interviews on people using Skype. They find it the most fantastic channel they can imagine. They can speak, with families abroad, see them, really share moments. So it's not even an indicator of the level of emotional attachment that a channel, actually, I would say maybe it's the contrary. So what I really see here is this inverse relationship. So why are people so attentive to attention? Why is it such a critical dimension in the choice of channel? What it is an indicator of is, in fact, of something very fundamental social relationship that we are very, very capable of recognizing. I will give you an example. I am sure that in most cases it would not cross your mind, unless you're vice president to actually call up your CEO. We have a clear identification of the status of somebody according to the amount of attention we can request from him, request to a certain person. It is part of our identification, in a sense, of the status, the mutual status we have with someone, is how much attention I can request from that person, how much attention am I willing to give to that person. So while a CEO can very easily ring a subordinate up at whatever hour of the day and expect full attention from him, vice versa, a subordinate will not request full attention from his CEO in that, and will choose another type of channel. Now, to bring it down to a different level of relationship, if you're very much it's the first stages of a relationship and you're very much in love with someone, there's one person waiting for that phone call, and there's probably one person, making that phone call. Or again, to make another example, recently, we were interviewing some young girls young students from Algeria who were living in Europe, and also their brothers were living in Europe while their families were abroad. Now, the girls were telling me, yes, we talk with our brothers very regularly. And we say, so, what time of day do you ring them up? I say, no, I never ring my brother. I send him an SMS, and then he decides to call me. And it's up to him to decide, in a certain sense, does he want to talk a lot? Does he only want to talk, for a few minutes? So what I'm saying here is that the status in the relationship, and it doesn't just have to be a professional hierarchy, it can also be a relational hierarchy, is really determining, again, how much attention we are willing to get. And what I'm arguing is that there is really, in the choice of channel, this is going to be a massive determinant of which channel I use for which interaction, which also means that as designers of communication services, it is something that we have to take into account when we're thinking, what are the characteristics of the channels that we are designing? Which are the type of social interaction? Which is the level of attention that this channel will? And it is quite interesting for me that something like Facebook has actually introduced within its organization 3 levels of attention, 3 channels in a certain sense that request different attentions. And within that platform, we have very different behaviors and very different, so we go from something that we can use for 150 and something that we're only using for 3, 4, or 5 people. I'd just like to finish off with one unreadable quote from the end. There's a very good American sociologist called Charles Derber who studied this phenomenon of attention and status, and he analyzes the difference in status between people around how much attention somebody is expecting and expected not to give, and how much attention, and he talks of the invisibility of some people and the very strong visibility on others. So I think I'll close on this. Thank you.